So, we are going to discuss today, broadly speaking, two topics. One is France, and the other is Palestine slash West Asia. Rami, being in France, has had an opportunity to investigate on the ground the political unrest that is escalating in the country, and he's going to start our discussion today by sharing with us what he's learned. And then we're going to do a roundup of events from Palestine and other parts of West Asia, followed by a critical look, to put it mildly, at the EU's really quite pathetic attempts to sanction Israel. Not all states in the EU being on board with the very meager initiatives we're seeing from Belgium and Spain. But in any ways, we're going to take a close look at that and compare those sanctions to the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia. So, Rami, with that as background, perhaps you can take us through the explosive situation unfolding in France.
Yes, but Dimitri, just before we start, there's been reports coming out that there's a $45 million contract between Netanyahu's office and Google or YouTube, right? This platform where most of people are watching us at the moment. And the purpose of this contract is to kind of basically whitewash Israel's genocide and starvation. And what's interesting is that the Netanyahu's prime minister office started publishing videos discrediting that there's a famine or that there's a lack of food in Gaza. There's one kind of screenshot from one of the videos that says there's food in Gaza. Any other claim is a lie. And I remember, Dimitri, maybe you could fact check me on this, but I remember reading about journalists during the Nuremberg trial that were arrested and tried for complicity in the crimes of World War II. So it's just quite intriguing to see the extent to which American corporations, mass media are playing a role in whitewash and enabling Netanyahu from whitewashing his crimes online. And there's probably going to be definitely a precedent, or I mean, I expect lawyers to hold these corporations accountable. Of course, it will be very difficult. But yeah, Dimitri, that's
just on the note of Nuremberg, you're absolutely right, Rami. Julius Sebastian Streicher was a German publicist, politician, and convicted war criminal, member of the Nazi Party. He was founder and publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, and he was tried and convicted of crimes against humanity during the Nuremberg trials and was hung by the neck until he was dead. A fate, frankly, which many of the most vile propagandists of the Netanyahu regime deserve every bit as much, in my opinion, as Julius Streicher. And he was not the only Nazi propagandist who was tried by the Nuremberg tribunals.
So yes, so that's just a little. I mean, I think it's important to put some emphasis on YouTube's complicity as well in this genocide as we're streaming on their platform, and hope to see more platforms rise up, with more ethical standards, to say the very least. So, Dimitri, I'm currently not exactly in Paris. I'm 2 metro stops away in a suburban region called Nanterre, which is right next to the financial capital of Paris, right? La Défense, where there's all the large towers. Dimitri, I believe you lived in Paris for a few years, so you probably maybe know these places. And while I was just walking around, Dimitri, I have an unhealthy habit of like walking 30,000 steps a day. I was seeing a lot of like graffitis honoring a teenager named Nahel Merzouk. And I remember hearing briefly about Nahel Merzouk, who was killed by a police officer in France, in Paris. And seeing all these graffitis really made me be curious and to reread about Nahel. And it turns out that he was killed right around the place that I'm staying in. This is my apartment unit, just a 5-minute walk. The police tried to arrest him as he was in his car, and then during the arrest, the police officer pulled out a gun and shot and killed him. It sparked large protests across France, protesting against police brutality, but also the natural dynamics between immigrant populations, diasporas, and the lack of investment and repression towards immigrant communities here in France, and the state racism that is pushed against Algerians, Moroccans, West Africans. And I think it's important to talk about all these immigrant communities all have a deep historical tie to France, one that was not chosen, mainly because France colonized North Africa, West Africa, actually large parts of Asia as well. And by exploiting all of those wealth and oppressing, I mean, there's 150 years of oppression here in Algeria, sorry, committed by France. Naturally, people will start migrating back to the empire, to the imperial core, as did many immigrant communities from Morocco and Algeria. And you cannot discount truly the colonial or neo-colonial history of France to the murder of Nahel Merzouk and the continuous repression of these communities here in France. And I think it's also important to recognize as well France has territories across the world. There's the French Guyana in kind of South America, but also there are two territories that the United Nations recognizes as illegally occupied, or that France is intentionally removing the self-determination of the Kanaki people. It's more known as New Caledonia in English, or French Polynesia as well, which is a separate territory. And these are just called territoires d'outre-mer in French, which means outer seas territories in English. In 1986, the UN put French Polynesia back on the list of non-self-governing territories, recognizing that it has a right to decolonization. And then since then, the UN has repeatedly called on France to allow self-determination through a referendum. France has never let the people of Kanaki nor French Polynesia to run a referendum in order to seek their self-determination. And then France, however, refused to recognize this UN designation and considers French Polynesia an internal matter. And I think these territories are 17,000 kilometers away from France. They're undoubtedly occupied and colonized. France has repressed the indigenous culture there and has been imposing French culture over them through schools and assimilating them. Although France currently has the audacity to criticize China or Russia, which are they themselves dealing with border disputes, who are seeking for, their own territorial integrity, yet France, that is colonizing territories and islands across every ocean, are the first ones to point the finger to others.
And supporting the most aggressive colonizer in the world today, Israel.
Committing a genocide and, of course, a famine. And while I was here in Paris, Dimitri, I attended an event organized by a group called Verges Palestine, a group of Palestinians here in France. And one of the events was a woman from Gaza, from a Palestinian girl who was born in Tunisia. Her family really believed in this mission that Palestinians should return. So in the 1990s, after the Oslo Accord, the family moved from Tunisia back to Palestine in Gaza. And she was telling her story how she had to leave Gaza after October 7th during the genocide. She was working for the French ministry. She was probably the only person in Gaza working for the French ministry. And she was telling her story about how she was forced to flee. And I think it was very powerful to hear the first account of this Palestinian woman from Gaza, the atrocities that she's seen, the restrictions that Israel has been putting, but also the way the French legal system are trying to remove her Palestinian identity by giving her the status of apatride, which is kind of like a stateless person. Although she has a Palestinian passport, she clearly identifies as being Palestinian. But there's an ongoing challenge for Palestinians where our identity is trying to be revoked, right? So it's like we're fighting for the land, but also fighting for the ability to identify as Palestinians. And then more recently, in 3 days, right, on the 10th of September, there will be a very large strike. It is organized under the name of Bloquons Tout, which means block everything. It's a decentralized call that was made by just individuals on social media calling for a massive strike on the 10th of September. It was sparked by a $44 billion austerity plan unveiled by Prime Minister François Bayrou in July 2025. The plan includes measures such as eliminating 2 public holidays, freezing pensions, and cutting public services. After gaining massive support by workers, by students, the workers' unions have decided to, and political parties have decided to back the call for the decentralized strike. And it's important for the unions to support the strikers, since they're able to bring kind of legal support, right? So striking has like a legal protection under French law. And the strike is taking the form of like staying at home, consumer boycotts, cash withdrawals from banks, and of course, direct actions. There are workers that will be blocking the périphérique, which is like this big highway that does a full circle around Paris. And there's been extremely large parallels, strong parallels between the strike that is happening on the 10th of September and the Gilets jaunes protest, which was sparked after a bill that wanted to do a tax hike on fuel, which ended up being like a 2-3 year long protest. Some protests reaching over 300,000 people in size. So what we might witness on the 10th of September, I'll be on the ground, Dimitri, recording, trying to document the strike. And we hope to see this protest reach the size of the Gilets jaunes, if not bigger. And I think it's also important, Dimitri, to point out that the French Prime Minister was appointed by Emmanuel Macron after the recent elections in 2024, July 2024, which the Nouveau Front Populaire won 180 seats, right? They won they're the largest bloc in the French parliament, yet Macron never gave a chance to this bloc to run the government, to set up a cabinet, or to be appointed as prime minister to build a government. Instead, Macron has picked on the center and right-wing parties to build a coalition, or to form a cabinet. And that's why we're seeing the protest, Dimitri, because if Macron would have followed the democratic outcome of the elections, we would have seen a leftist government in power, which would have brought in a budget, which would have been much more legitimate and had more popular support, considering they won the elections. But sadly, or unfortunately, Macron decided to break the tradition of picking the winners of the elections to build a cabinet, and instead decided to just pick the center parties or right-wing parties to form a government. Yeah.
So the reportedly France's debt to GDP is now about 114%. Its debt to GDP ratio, and its deficit is, I think, nearly double the EU limit of 3%. So it is under severe fiscal pressure. But at the same time, I understand, Rami, they've signed on to the insane notion of increasing their military spending to 5% of GDP. And your interactions there with people, I mean, obviously people are very unhappy with the cuts, social security, to social programs, and, the loss of holidays, which the French, I remember living in Paris and Nice, the French cherish their holidays with good reason. People deserve to have robust holidays as far as I'm concerned. But, have they talked much about the flip side of this budget, which is this massive increase in military spending? Are you hearing people on the ground express outrage about that, or they focused more on the cuts in spending?
So these protests are decentralized, Dimitri. So many people are attending these protests. There's going to be a Palestinian bloc at the 10th of September, right? I think there's a lot of parallels between the austerity measures, signing off to sending weapons to Ukraine, supporting America's war on Russia, and I mean the complicity of the French government on the genocide in Gaza, There will definitely be people from the Konaki movement seeking for self-determination and independence and freedom for the Konaki people. So it's a catch-all type of protest. Now, you see different political parties, different groups advertising their own purposes or their own reasoning for the strike. Just outside of my apartment, Dimitri, there's like a big sign that specifically mentions the militarization of Europe, the massive spending of weapons as one of the core reasons for the strike. Yesterday was a protest for Palestine in Republic Square in Paris, and there were some stickers that I found on streetlights saying "We're not going to die for Ukraine." So I think there are also going to be many more liberals at the protest that are just going to take this strike at face value, right? As just being against simple austerity measures. But the reality on the ground, Dimitri, is that this is a catch-all, like a kind of a big tent type of movement.
Right.
And I believe that the core of the issue here is also mostly the undemocratic. I mean, France, I believe, is the second least democratic country in Europe. It's just behind Hungary in terms of assessment of democratic practices. Municipalities have very low to minimal powers. The president could basically uphold any decision he wants, bypassing any parliamentary decisions. So, I mean, it's truly going to be a battle between the unions and the government. And we know that the French police is able to be extremely repressive, able to fight the protesters. I've attended my fair share of protests here in Paris over the last 5 years, Dimitri, and I've never seen as much tear gas being thrown around.
Wow.
So I think it's going to be quite an eventful day on the 10th of September.
Now, I just have one other question, which I don't want to preempt the audience members who want to ask about this in the Q&A, but I saw one question about Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is largely, I think, perceived, and with good reason, to be, he's the de facto leader of a political party called La France Insoumise, with good reason considered to be the de facto leader of the left in France nowadays. You didn't mention his name. Is he emerged as a leader of this protest movement, or is he sort of waiting in the wings to perhaps use this opportunity to empower the left?
So recently, La France Insoumise ended up supporting the strike. Among other political parties, I believe the Communist Party in France, which has some form of representation in parliament and in certain municipalities, they have endorsed the protests. I've sensed from speaking to certain people that Jean-Luc Mélenchon has been taking a bit of a step back, seen as a divisive figure in certain cases. Not that I necessarily agree with that assessment, but it seems like the left in France is heavily fragmented. There's multiple different parties. There's the new anti-capitalist party. There's probably 5 or 6 different communist parties. And it seems like Jean-Luc Mélenchon may have had his fair share of criticism and his dealing. I don't think it's due to the Nouveau Front Populaire. Well, just in building the Nouveau Front Populaire, Dimitri, when they were like kind of building a big coalition of all the leftist groups. The so-called pseudo-socialist party, which is not socialist at all, led by Glucksmann, has specifically called out against Jean-Luc Mélenchon being part of any form of coalition. So I don't think he was the face of that movement back then. Yeah.
But based on what I've seen, I've been able to glean from the situation, he's also been Corbynized, Mélenchon. He's been viciously attacked as an anti-Semite with no justification that I'm aware of because of his strong support for the Palestinian people. So I think that's part of the problem he has encountered in terms of emerging as a true leader of the opposition. In any event, Rami, did you have anything else to add, or should we move on to our Palestine?
The last thing I wanted to say, Dimitri, is I think one of my biggest idols, Dimitri, is a lawyer named Jacques Verges, Maître Jacques Verges. I had the pleasure or the honor of visiting his grave in Montparnasse Cemetery. He's known as the devil's advocate, or l'avocat de la terreur, which is like the basically the devil's advocate would be the translation of this. He defended Jamil Abu Haidid, which was an Algerian revolutionary who targeted colonial presence in Algeria. He was supposed to defend Saddam Hussein, but due to the family's decision, he ended up not doing so. He defended Carlos Ilich Ramirez. Among Khmer Rouge, I think it was Kirsafan, he ended up defending in court. No one he has ever defended got the death penalty. When he was asked if he would have defended Hitler in court, he replied, "I would have also defended Bush. Everyone has the right to a fair trial."
Wow.
So
He was quite a man.
This is probably an amazing way to answer this question, right? So
yeah.
So I think
I've long admired as a lawyer Jacques Verges. He's an extraordinary counsel. His tactic, people really should watch if you haven't seen it. The documentary about Verges, l'avocat du diable. But as I recall, when he defended the Algerian revolutionary, he basically openly and aggressively challenged the legitimacy of the court in the colonial court in Algeria that was tasked with passing judgment upon her. And so his strategy was not to play within the rules, but to say that the rules are illegitimate, which was a really bold, an unusual strategy for a council to employ.
Dimitri,
sorry, go ahead.
Go for it.
I'm sorry. I finished with my comment. I was going to move on to the Palestine roundup.
I was just going to say, Dimitri, that the first time I went to Paris, like 4 or 5 years ago, my first stop was at the house where he was living. Sadly, he had died just 5 years prior. And the second stop is his grave at the cemetery. And every time I go back to France, those are always my first stops, just to honor this gentleman who's an example for all of us to follow, of defending justice and of defending the people that no one else wants to defend, right? So he actually, Dimitri, for 7 years, he lived in exile. No one knew where he was. There were rumors that he might have been living amongst the Palestinians. So
I recall that.
Massive.
Just so people, absolutely. If people don't know of Jacques Verges, his last name is spelled V as in Victor, E-R-G-E-S. So we do recommend you look him up.